live. So, hey there, everyone. Episode 15 of Around the Bend podcast. I have the pleasure of having Elliott Beckstrom here. Sorry, I probably messed up your name. From FiveTran. Elliott, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Elliott Beckstrom. I'm an enterprise account executive with FiveTran. I've been with the company about 3 years and change, and happy to share some thoughts on data ingestion.
And also, I think, Martin, you almost might be running my show at this point. This is your third or fourth appearance, I believe.
Who counts?
Exactly.
Hi, I'm Martin Miller, and I'm CTO of Invision, along with through Fast CTO.
It's a great intro. I love it. I really wanted to bring Elliott on pretty much just because dealing with so many companies in the data engineering space, really FiveTran, I would say, is a leader in the data ingestion part of whatever you want to call it, the ETL pipeline, the modern data stack. They're part of a small handful of companies that really are on the cutting edge of the modern data stack. And I mean, through many podcasts and news articles and things, you'll keep seeing that term getting repeated over and over and over again. But I wanted to hear it from the horse's mouth, itself. What is, tell us a little bit more about FiveTran and how it's good for companies, Elliott.
Yeah, sure. So I guess probably the best place to start is on going over kind of like a why FiveTran exists, right? And what we do. So as a lot of people are familiar or may not be familiar with, a lot of companies are going towards analytics, right? And in doing analytics, there are multiple pieces of that puzzle that have to come together to be able to push out, the pretty dashboards that end users are looking at or executives are looking at, or being able to build these, artificial intelligence or machine learning models. The base requirement for all of that is being able to get your data from the different sources and different systems that you're using into a place that you can turn it into a usable format, or into a place that has the engine to actually be able to run those kind of models, to run those kind of algorithms, to have a repository. So where FiveTran came in is often kind of the historical thought around, people had databases, right? There was acres of data center farms with IBM and Oracle and everything else. And, the Informaticas of the world came around. Teradata's kind of came to exist as some of what we call like a legacy data warehouse. And then with the advent of Snowflake coming out and tools like Databricks and Redshift and BigQuery, with the big modern cloud data warehouses, one of the hardest things that data engineering teams ran into was actually being able to get their source data from, your Salesforces, your SQL servers, your S3 files, different types of data sources into those warehouses, so that they could actually go and use the hyperscale compute that those different warehouses offer to be able to do SQL logic, to be able to go ahead and go do, Spark jobs, other things on the repository of all that data. And so that's where FiveTran comes in. Is our methodology and kind of our mantra is that we want to make access to data as simple and reliable as electricity. So just like plugging an extension cord into the wall, right? I've got my extension cord, I've plugged it into Salesforce. It's all populating in a FiveTran database inside of Snowflake. So I'd say that's kind of the general overview and gist of where FiveTran came from and kind of what we exist as. And in more recent time, I'd say over the last, say, 12 to 18 months or so, what we've been seeing, especially upmarket in our, Fortune 500 enterprises, large state and local government, federal government type of customers, is going from that base kind of ingestion layer and moving into more of a tool for data movement, right? So initially, the data stack started where you have this pipeline tool to get things in there, or maybe an ETL tool where you're transforming it before you actually get to the warehouse. FiveTran goes off of extract, load, and then transform post-warehouse ingest is our methodology. But going from beyond just that ingest piece, warehouse piece, BI tool, dashboarding piece sitting on top of it, to having these distributed architectures that say, okay, well, if we're at X Fortune 500 company, this line of business is using a Redshift instance. This line of business is using Snowflake. This line of business is using Google BigQuery. Obviously, we have all these distributed systems under them. Some are going in between the others, in between different warehouses. They may have one large S3 data lake or something like that sitting under these warehouses, right? And so with FiveTran's capabilities of being able to extract and load from most of these different both sources and destinations, what we're seeing now is a lot of companies, especially in the larger kind of up market, are using FiveTran not only to ingest from source to, say, a main reporting data warehouse with Snowflake. They may also be sending a ton of data over to an S3 data lake that they could be running EMR on for, machine learning jobs in AWS, or S3 writing through our Databricks writer that's sitting in Delta Lake. So it's not in their lakehouse format that might be, or it's not technically all in their lakehouse. They can obviously pull it in there. We can write in there into Spark SQL as well. But that's what we're starting to see, is that instead of kind of just a one-way pipeline, which FiveTran is, it's not just going from source to target once. We may have multiple distributions across these organizations. And so it's turning into more of a data movement tool, I'd say, than an ingest tool. But I'll get off my soapbox for a minute and let you guys jump in.
I mean, there was a lot of important things there. And sometimes on this, everyone here is so smart. You're so specialized in your field. If we zoom out a little bit and just talk about that modern data stack. So you guys are bringing that data to the data warehouse. What is, maybe Martin, you can elaborate a little bit more on this, why FiveTran is important. Where does the data go from the warehouse, and why do companies do this?
Yeah, Blake, let me step back a level and maybe not, maybe I'll say it. I'm going to dumb it down a little bit. I see FiveTran making a paradigm shift for ETL and data movement parallel to something, and I'll go to a different segment here. Think of like where Tableau sits, or Power BI, and then, or Looker, and then think about like Domo, a company like Domo. They're all four of them effectively have the capability of publishing dashboards that are used for analytics and BI. However, Domo really dumbed it down to being like these hypercards. You fill in the parameters and you do a WYSIWYG thing, and boom, your magic got an executive dashboard in about 15 minutes. And, that's very powerful. So what I see FiveTran has kind of done a parallel activity to ingestion, translation, and movement, which actually plays well with the vendors like the Snowflake, the Databricks, and being an advocate for automated data flow and data quality checks. And it plays a part of that whole life cycle. So data can come from a large system, an e-commerce system. The data that comes out of the e-com system, it's sitting, let's take a vendor like an SAP, and it may not be the best place for doing my visualizations for business intelligence or for my automation workflow that will lead to a machine learning program for some initiative and automation. And FiveTran could lay right in that window right there and augment and probably enhance some of the existing tooling capability and potentially supplant like my use of Informatica per se, as probably a good case in point. I'm aware of them supplanting Informatica in many, many cases. So, Elliott's the expert here on his product line. I don't want to overspeak and oversell for him. Although I am available for hire, Elliott. The truth of the matter is, I think FiveTran is a paradigm shift to what I would call last generation or previous generation way of thinking.
And that's kind of one thing. Go for it, Elliott. Take it.
I was going to say, Martin, I think, first of all, you brought brevity to that just verbal spew that I gave out at the beginning. So I appreciate you for that. But I would agree. And I think the paradigm shift, and that may be kind of like the core of FiveTran, is that ELT versus ETL, where now that we have those warehouses, right? Like the need comes from the end piece, from the ThoughtSpots, the Sigmas, the Tableaus, the Lookers of the world, because that's where everyone's actually seeing the data. And then it's the need that kind of comes backwards, and it's like, well, we can't dashboard on marketing analytics if we don't have our Google ads or Snapchat ads or Facebook ads in the place that those tools are pulling from. And the reason that FiveTran does the ELT and our parallel ingest, where our pipes are one source to one target on each one, is to enable those transformations to happen inside of Snowflake, so that you can make a view that has 10 different sources, but off that one source coming in, you could build dozens of different views. So I think that is the paradigm shift, where, to your point, with like an Informatica previously, where you say, I want this opportunity table from Salesforce, I want this opportunity table from NetSuite, I want this piece from somewhere else, and you pre-merge it and then shove it in. It's like pre-cutting a puzzle piece, so it only fits in one place. Where if you have it all in one place and it's consistently being updated with change data capture, the opportunity to do much more with it downstream is available. So that's my take on the paradigm shift, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Go for it, Martin. Sorry, I'm just cutting everybody off today.
Blake, it's the Blake show, but it's all fair. I'll be real brief again. The fun part is FiveTran did the heavy lifting for a lot of connectors, Blake, and these connectors allow them to go for these third-party source systems or third-party connecting systems where data may be resident or in transit, which is super powerful. So, I mean, I'm just giving you a rough number. I know they have about 300-ish connectors available, including LinkedIn. So if you want to pull analytics for your needs, Blake, FiveTran's your source.
Well, if I had enough business myself, I'm sure I'd love to use it. One thing I've heard, from a lot of, especially like higher level senior data engineers, staff data engineers, things of that, like, they all say FiveTran is like the top of its field, and there's not really currently, I mean, there's always new competition that comes and goes, but at the moment, there's no one that really surpasses or directly competes with FiveTran in the same way of what you guys are able to do. And I want to kind of highlight what you said. You said you guys are becoming an ELT, not an ETL. Is that correct?
ELT is what we were started and have continued as forever. So we would just say ETL is the legacy method of doing kind of what we do.
And I just like to break things down and dumb them down, one for myself, because sometimes I talk to really smart people and I don't always understand what you guys are talking about. So from my understanding, the old way of transporting data was extract, transform, and load. And FiveTran takes a different approach where you extract, load, and transform. The methodology, I'm guessing, behind that is that why would you transform data before you've even gotten in the place where you can really analyze it? Is that a correct assessment? Okay.
Pretty much. It's that, and then just the flexibility, right? If you pre-transform it, you have preset this thing in stone. So it's I think the flexibility and being able to have the raw data at 1-to-1 from source to target, it helps with the data validation and everything as well. But yeah, to your point, I think you summed it up pretty well, Blake.
Well, I know too, you guys have a really smart team there. A lot of the product over time has been built by a gentleman by the name of Fraser Harris, very intelligent. And we've had like brief chats here and there, but one thing I really kind of wonder is why if everyone else was doing the ETL, what made them really make that shift in that design, to kind of change what the whole market was doing. I think engineers, this is my, you know what, Martin, this will be a good question for you. I feel like engineers, they have a tendency to design something and think very deep, very thoughtfully about why they make it, but they have a tendency to say, wow, this is a really good solution that I made, and we shouldn't change the solution too much. So I'm sure that over time, the methodology behind ETL was like, hey, we made such a beautiful solution to this without understanding maybe some of the opportunities missed. What do you think about that?
So let me see if this makes sense. What has happened probably in the last 10 years is easy to see with the machine learning and artificial intelligence initiatives, which are driven by data science, if you want to follow the trend. And often you may take a piece of data and you may think about it as, oh, it's a bunch of rows and columns of information. And if you do some transformational things up front, you've made a decision on what you're doing with it. You may be popping stuff out of it, you may be flipping it around, but in a data science experiment, I may want some of that original raw data. So then I'm going to have to bypass anything that's gone through an ETL tool like Informatica and go back to the raw data. And I want to load it and I want to munge it to the way I want it, which effectively is like feature engineering kind of way of thinking in data science world. And to load it and then let me munge it myself or transform it myself to the way I need it for this experiment, it makes more sense because I may have the same raw data for another experiment and I want to twist it a different direction. So that's where I would come to the table and say, I support this because it makes no sense for me to even have the ETL process in the front that I'm just going to throw away and go back to the raw data.
Mm-hmm. Elliot, do you have any maybe classic examples where this kind of switch solution, in real life or I guess real time has made a really big impact for your customers, like switching from one of those older style tools to FiveTran? Sorry to
Yeah,
put you
I
on the
mean,
spot.
I guess no, that's fine. I'll probably leave customer names out of it just so we're
Yeah.
clean as far as that goes. So I mean, there's a couple different reasons that customers come to FiveTran from those legacy vendors. What I would say is typically it's with the adoption of a modern cloud data warehouse like Snowflake. I mean, Snowflake is our biggest destination. That's where we send most of the data to. Predominant amount of our 6,700 customers are on Snowflake. And so with Snowflake, they've developed that into be basically one of the best SQL query engines ever, right? And if you have something hooked up, to Martin's point where it's kind of like predefined and you can't be agile with it, that, super flexible compute and all the capabilities that you have with Snowflake don't get optimized as much, right, as with FiveTran. Because with FiveTran, you're coming into that raw layer warehouse, right? We're coming into that initial FiveTran database. There might be a FiveTran Salesforce, FiveTran NetSuite, all your different sources, right? And their own individual databases inside of Snowflake. And that is your raw layer right at the beginning. And then from there, using tools like dbt or coalesce, or even just SQL scripts inside of Snowflake, you can go and be flexible with the kind of views that you want to make. So that FiveTran, Salesforce database that's there, some of the customers I've worked with, they wanted to move away from it. They said, well, we're scheduling and running, hundreds of jobs every day with their legacy tool to be able to actually deliver the right views and the right schemas to then report up through Tableau and Power BI, right, to their end users. And so not only is that complicated because if a job fails, right, that data engineer has to go back, fix the job or fix the pipeline, find out what happened. Was it a source side issue? Was there an API outage from, one of the inputs on third-party sources that was coming in? Was it a networking problem? Where was it? Where with FiveTran, since we're in an automated fashion, we call ourselves a item-potent solution as well, which means self-healing. So if we miss an incremental sync, that means the next incremental sync time that's supposed to happen, if the API connection had gone down, it comes up, we pick up all the changes from the last successful one. So we can provide alerting, but typically the data engineers only have to work with the data inside of Snowflake instead of having to work with it before. So we say our best customers have forgotten their passwords. That is the main reason that we have started taking a lot of market share from these legacy vendors, is that FiveTran is truly built off automation, and candidly, we want customers working with the data and on the data, and that happens post-load. So that's why we want the transformation piece after we load. We want them working with it in Snowflake and in the BI tools. But go ahead.
So it's really fascinating to think about a customer potential for you that is, they're built on an e-commerce engine from a big e-commerce company. They've got this ETL thing in the place from the big I company with their Informatica following it, and then there's a lot of labor in that. And imagine walking into a deal and you're trying to sell your solution into that customer. could you talk me through, first of all, how you approach that customer and explain potentially how you're going to replace or change their life at what cost? And there's a cost to switch, as you're aware.
Yeah.
And maybe, in like a short, brief time, could you walk us through maybe an engagement might be 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years? I mean, how do you get off of Informatica kind of example?
Yeah. So like a specific example, and where we usually end up coming in is new data source. So end user with a dashboard needs a new data source. They go to the data engineering team. Data engineering team says to build the Informatica logic, to build that pipeline, it will take us 6 weeks. I've heard even up to 6 months to provision one pipeline for the new source, right? They go and look at Snowflake Partner Connect or Databricks Partner Connect or something like that. How can we get some of this data in? Oh, there's FiveTran. Let's go look at the FiveTran docs. There's 300 some plus connectors there. That one's available. So usually that's how the conversation begins, because we can get it in there relatively quickly. I mean, if it's a pre-built connector, a lot of our API connections, it's only username and password. We populate all the tables available, start the ingest. From there, that's typically where the conversation expands. So what we'll ask, obviously, is like, you have an incumbent. You are clearly already bringing data into this warehouse. Who are they? Right? So they hopefully tell us who they are. And then we'll ask, what is the typical process that happens when you have an end user or an end group? So say sales operations brings down a request to the data team, says they need to have, a lead to order use case put together for reporting for their segment, and then up to CRO, CEO, something like that. They can walk us through the process. It may be they get a ServiceNow ticket, they ask for this source, they do that, and it says, well, then what happens? Oh, well, then we go and provision a pipeline, we come up with the transformation, How long does it take? They'll go through that part. And so if we hear, exactly, going down the steps, how many steps is it? Oh, well, it's a lot of steps. It's these steps. If it's a legacy vendor, typically they're also installed on infrastructure that's internal. So then there's IT approvals that have to happen, occasionally security approvals that have to happen as well. So that is where they end up kind of like bringing their own pain out with it. And if they can hook up one FiveTran connector and get it successfully loaded, and typically that setup happens in less than 15 minutes, and they see the data coming into their warehouse, the questions start out coming up about what else can you get in here. And that's where we start chewing through the different sources, how they want to replicate them. But that's typically how it works. And then if we go to talk about it more on the business side than the technical, right? Where we come in with that automation piece is an optimization of your human capital hours, because you want your data engineers actually engineering the data, not backtracking fixes and trying to do things with pipelines. So if a data engineering team says they spend 100, 200 hours a week on managing pipelines or running jobs or scripts or something like that, you can back into what that cost is, right? So when they say, okay, well, we have to spend X amount of hours just to make sure the data is getting there, what's your opportunity cost also of having those 200 hours out of being able to actually go, do DBT transformations and things like that on the data in the warehouse, and actually doing the engineering part versus just worrying about the ingest. So when we go and talk to our CIOs, CTOs, kind of C-level boards, those are typically what we're talking about. And then just time to data, basically. How long can you afford to not have that RevOps use case that you said delivery might take 6 months just on the ingest piece before the dashboards are built? Can you afford to have that, or are you willing to give up the opportunity cost to move over? So that's typically how these sales cycles go. That might have been a little more long-winded than you're looking for, Martin, but that sort of sums it up.
Yeah, and I can appreciate that. Do you use professional service companies external to you? Do you run your own professional services? How do you, because the implementation at the client side could be very sticky. Once you're in there, you see the underbelly, and it's not as pretty as it looked from the outside.
Yeah. Yeah. So typically, especially when the databases get involved, things are just they're not all rainbows and unicorns and flowers anymore. So we have a plethora of consulting partners that we work with, from, the large big fours all the way down to some, one or two person systems integration shops. PH Data and Hakoda are two of the ones we work with a ton. Slalom as well. So they're all very well versed in our services. Candidly, most FiveTran connectors don't take that much consulting. So occasionally it actually maybe works against us when the SOW shrinks a lot for the ingest piece. I hope none of them take offense to that, but I know it's happened a few times. But where they gain from that as well is that since we get the data there so fast, a lot of these consulting partners like leaning on FiveTran because they can prove out their value that they have with their data engineers, their staffing on it, to potentially build up that warehouse that FiveTran's going to, especially if it is a migration from one stack of, say, like an Informatica to Redshift to a modern stack of a FiveTran Snowflake DBT, something like that. So we do have professional services internally as well that we can render, but we do like working with third-party consultants also, because like we were talking about even at the beginning of the call, there are different distinct pieces of this data stack that have to work together. FiveTran will hold responsibility for our services to get that data, get the setup to get the data in. Once we're post-load, we pretty much go hands off because that is outside of our scope. So that's why these third-party consultants are awesome, because they can lay over the whole top part from FiveTran, Snowflake, your ThoughtSpots, your Sigmas, Lookers, all that stuff on the far end, as well as working in the DBT and the transformations part.
I think one funny, because me and Elliot had an aside at one of these social events recently, and some of these more traditional consulting firms, they love the Informaticas and they love these old tools because they require so much extra work, so much extra time to integrate, so much extra things to build. And the modern data stack, a lot of these things are automated with tools like FiveTran. So why do you need a 6-month project when you can do it yourself in 15 minutes? It's an interesting change.
Martin, you look like you were going to take that. I can give my take, but I think, Martin, you should share your thoughts on that.
Well, Blake, the reality is change management, and internal thinkers, there's gravitational forces that work against something so simple as a username and password. Network opening up for a point of presence, network opening up to allow data to flow from point A to point B. There's so many frictional pieces. So that's why I was asking about third party versus your own, because once you're in the underbelly of an organization integrating, you actually have to be immersed to the point of actually chasing it, or having an advocate that's with you, that they're going to knock them out, and having an SME specifically know about networking, internetworking, how ServiceNow interactions could happen. Some companies do ServiceNow really well and they rock it with automation and scripts. Some places it's just a placeholder to create an email for someone to do something. Your mileage would vary as a professional services company. I've worked with Slalom, so I can speak highly of them. I have worked with some of the other larger firms without naming. And mileage varies depending on, they're large firms, right? And, Slalom's a little more boutique-ish, but they're good size. And having technical acumen, because I'm aware of how they interview, and it's not necessarily the lowest cost resources. They're top resources, but they're optimized to deliver sooner. So if I'm overselling for you, Elliot, I'm sorry. I can't help. But that's a good choice, that some of the names you brought up.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I mean, I've been here for a little over 3 years, which in FiveTran time, I guess, is long. So, the ones I mentioned are ones that have very well proven themselves to be very solid partners that our customers like as well. And to your point, Martin, I think the most important thing, and the reason these third-party partners are so helpful, is that they can be sort of a voice of reason across the whole piece. Where we hit a wall with an incumbent champion or something, right? It's like, I'm going to go to the networking guy and say, you can't get access to this private link or this VPN, and the connector can't get set up. Where when they're going at it from the strategic view at the top of saying, okay, business, what is your outcome you're looking for? We want executive reporting for revenue, whatever. Then they work down through the BI layer, through the warehouse layer, what sources need to get there, then how do the sources get there, right? And so I think managing it from the top down and kind of taking it from a business outcome, that's the other thing that these third parties can help with, because they're looking at the whole pie. So I'd say Martin hit it on the head there with why we lean on our consulting partners so hard.
There's a huge opportunity in expanding into what I call data observability, and literally in the observability space on its own. And I'm aware you have a connector with one vendor specifically that is in observability, and that's traditionally, in this case, Splunk, and they're more of reporting, analysis, but they're also in observability. And I noticed there wasn't one for Datadog, and I'm going, oh my God, the up and coming kid on the block for data observability. They're trying to displace Splunk and what they do and displace New Relic. And my goodness, do I have to do your business development here?
So we do have an integration with Datadog. That's a clarification on our documentation. So as far as like source connectors, there's a source Splunk connector.
Yes.
As far as the logging services that we integrate with Splunk and with Datadog for logging. So Datadog, to your point, I mean, they're absolutely killing it, doing unreal job at all the metrics tracking, logging, everything else. So all of FiveTran's logs can natively be hooked up to basically show inside of Datadog. So for monitoring, that is an option. I have a number of customers using Datadog for that as well. But yes, to your point, source side connection. We just haven't been asked to pipe Datadog data to a Snowflake or something. Otherwise, we build that connector. Typically, when customers are asking us about Datadog and FiveTran, it's about the logging and monitoring and having FiveTran's logs basically going back and forth between them.
Very good, very good. The reason I bring this up is another area. It's tangential. It's called AI ops, and there's a lot of vendors that play in that space. And I don't think that's a right place for FiveTran as a source or a destination, but it could be a connector too. It may help with dashboarding for that and solutions. It's just an interesting play. I'm just throwing it out there. Mileage varies depending on your ability to put enough gas in the tank.
Yeah. So we've co-sold with those vendors. So like DataEQ, Data Robot. And that's one thing as well. FiveTran is a very partner-centric company. So if we're in a deal with Snowflake, we share Slacks with them, everything else. Like us and those reps and SEs are talking back and forth, planning the POCs, doing everything else together. And that's where, I've run a deal from start to finish with the Snowflake and DataEQ rep. And so they're obviously doing the ML ops portion of it. Even though we don't maybe integrate together directly in the softwares, obviously the data that we are delivering is what they are running those operations on. So that's where the sharing of information and just making sure that we consult, the customer correctly works together. But yeah, I'd be curious at some point if FiveTran would have native connections to like ML ops companies like that.
Well, I was saying AI ops, which is actually different, but I liked where you were going with it. I didn't want to interrupt you. It's fine.
Keep me honest.
You'll have to share this one with the team later and get Martin's thoughts over there. Cool. I mean, I think we covered a lot of good stuff. Is there maybe any stones we left unturned that you can think of?
Martin, I feel like I ran a monologue there for a lot of this. So
it's all good.
It's all good. I find it entertaining to get on calls like this because I speak with investors and I also speak with CEOs of companies on technologies and places things could go, and where they're laying their money out and where they could lay a roadmap. And I see a good future for FiveTran.
I've heard from a bunch of different people that have no what do you call it, when they have like no stake in the game, but they're looking at a company and they're like, wow, that company is doing really well. I repeatedly hear that from like data engineers, data scientists, things like that, and that's a super good sign. Just in general, at whatever the product is, if you have, people that play with it and are like, wow, that is the that's the top dog in that field. That's people telling you without no, or what do you call it? It's almost like a prediction of the future because that's what's top in the market.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm gonna go
I
off on
can't complain. It's going well.
I'm gonna go off on a total sidetrack here, but I feel like there was this concept from he was a really famous hedge fund manager in the 90s with Fidelity, and he ran the Contra Fund, and I can't remember his I can't remember his name, but he's like one of the most famous ever, and I'm gonna slap myself for not remembering it. But he made this observation. He's like, hey, whatever product, whatever service you see everyone buying into and using, doesn't matter what, the professionals say or the consultants say or the news says, that's what's really winning in the market. And if a lot of people who have no, stake in the game are like, this is the top product, then that just tells you where things are going. Yeah, I think it was like Peter something or Pete something or
There wasn't, but there's also another gentleman by the name. He was a portfolio manager. I just looked it up. Will Danoff took part of this, but it goes back into the '60s, and it's before he had a lot of automation available to him. So it's probably on little long pieces of paper with cross marks on and going through it manually.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think his example was like Kodak. Like that's how he made a bunch of money on. This is the 90s, we're talking about, and he's like he was looking at investing in, hey, which company has the most cutting edge camera technology? And he noticed every store he went to or every supermarket, everyone was buying Kodak, Kodak, Kodak. Everyone else said Kodak, and he invested in Kodak and made like 30% return, something crazy like that. And that, even though it's a simple concept, and yeah, that doesn't always work, it is a good indicator of like, hey, what do people actually like out on the market and what do they want to use as an important concept in itself. Yeah.
Point well taken.
Well, cool. Those are my 2 cents. But thank you guys for taking the time out to talk. And Elliot, very much happy you got on here to talk about FiveTran and give us a little bit of knowledge.
Yeah, thanks for having me and letting me share some of the FiveTran.
No problem. Hey, thank you guys. Have a good day, okay?
Cheers. Thank you.